Sarah Bennett had never planned on making history that Tuesday morning, but the events that would unfold would lead her down an unexpected path, one that would forever alter how she viewed her role within the justice system. The spring sun filtered through the tall windows of Boston's municipal court as Sarah sat quietly on a wooden bench, waiting for her case to be called. She had arrived directly from her morning seminar at Harvard Law, dressed in her casual navy blazer and comfortable flats, far from the formal attire she typically wore when attending courtrooms for more serious legal proceedings. The courthouse was bustling with its usual morning activity. Court officers briskly directed people through security, lawyers hurried past, briefcases in hand, and the constant murmur of voices echoed off the marble walls. Sarah observed the scene around her, noting how routine it all seemed. She was used to this kind of setting, yet today she was just another person waiting for her case to be called, sitting in a crowded courtroom full of strangers. At 43, Sarah had spent her entire career studying and teaching about the justice system. She was a seasoned law professor at Harvard, and her office walls were adorned with numerous accolades, including her doctorate in constitutional law and various published papers on civil rights. Yet today none of those accomplishments seemed to matter. Today Sarah was simply a woman who had received a parking ticket, and she had come to contest it in a court that she had visited many times before, as a legal professional but not as a defendant. The citation had arrived 3 weeks ago. It had been issued outside the Roxbury Community Center, where Sarah had been volunteering her time at a free legal clinic. She was assisting low-income residents with understanding their rights, offering her expertise to those who couldn't afford lawyers. It was a busy day, and one of her elderly clients had fallen ill. Sarah had parked in a no-parking zone for just a few minutes, hoping to assist the woman and help her reach her son's car. By the time Sarah returned, however, the parking enforcement officer had already written her a ticket. As she waited for her case to be called, Sarah checked her watch. It was 10:45 a.m. Her next class wasn't until 2 p.m., and she hoped the court would handle her case quickly so she could get back to work. Around her, the other people in the courtroom fidgeted nervously on the benches. A young mother tried to quiet a fussy baby, while an elderly man in a worn suit repeatedly checked his paperwork, his hands trembling. Sarah gave the man a reassuring smile, offering silent comfort in an otherwise tense environment. Suddenly, the bailiff's voice cut through the low hum of conversation. "Docket number 247, Sarah Bennett?" Sarah stood up, gathered her simple black handbag, and grabbed the folder containing the documentation she had prepared. As she walked toward the front of the courtroom, she couldn't help but notice that she was one of only 3 black people in the room. After 20 years in academia, Sarah was used to being the only person of color in many spaces, but it never stopped being noticeable. She had learned to navigate these spaces with grace, but the subtle weight of it was always there. Judge Richard Maxwell, a man in his early 60s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, barely looked up as she approached the podium. Known throughout the Boston legal community for his strict, no-nonsense interpretation of the law, Judge Maxwell's reputation preceded him. Sarah had even quoted one of his decisions in a recent paper she had written. She had respected him as a legal scholar, but she had no idea how this encounter would unfold. "Miss Bennett," Judge Maxwell said, still looking down at his papers. "You're contesting a parking violation from March 15th? Sarah immediately noticed the use of Miss, a subtle yet striking choice of title. She had been referred to as ma'am, or even doctor in the past, but the judge had opted for Mississippi. It wasn't a mistake she hadn't encountered before, and she knew better than to let it affect her demeanor. She had learned long ago to keep her voice steady and professional, no matter the circumstances. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied calmly, choosing her words carefully. "I can explain the situation that led to the temporary parking violation." The judge finally looked up, but his expression already showed signs of impatience. "The citation clearly states that you were parked in a no-parking zone for?" He checked the paper in front of him. 23 minutes. "Do you deny this?" "No, Your Honor," Sarah said. "But there were extenuating circumstances." She stood up straighter, hoping her professionalism and confidence would help her case. "I was conducting a legal clinic at the community center when one of my elderly clients fell ill. I parked temporarily in the no-parking zone to assist her." The judge didn't even let her finish. "The sign clearly stated no parking at any time," he said, his tone growing more condescending. "The law doesn't make exceptions for running late to appointments." Sarah felt her jaw tighten slightly, but she kept her composure. She knew how to handle moments like this, where facts were ignored and assumptions were made. She could feel the subtle injustice of the situation, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to let it go. "The fine is $120, Judge Maxwell continued, already reaching for his gavel. "Next time I suggest you plan your schedule better and respect the parking laws like everyone else." Sarah could feel the sting of his words. The young mother sitting nearby gasped softly, while the elderly man with the shaking hands lowered his gaze, seemingly embarrassed by the harsh tone. But Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her bag, not for her wallet but for something else. She pulled out her Harvard Law School faculty ID and her bar credentials. She knew that sometimes, the most powerful lesson wasn't in arguing or protesting. It was in allowing others to come to their own realizations. Sarah stood there for a moment, holding her credentials in front of her. The room fell deathly silent. The sound of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum louder as Judge Maxwell's eyes locked onto the Harvard faculty ID in Sarah's hand. His stern expression faltered as he saw the embossed crimson shield and the letters Pedich printed under her name. It was a momentary lapse in his composure, but it was noticeable to everyone in the room. "I apologize, Dr. Bennett," Judge Maxwell said slowly, his voice now more measured as he emphasized her correct title. "I didn't realize that you might be qualified to understand the law." There was a brief pause and Sarah's calm voice echoed through the room. "Or that someone who looks like me might be a Harvard professor?" she asked, her tone still professional, but laced with a quiet challenge. The young mother shifted forward in her seat, and even the court reporter, who had seen countless cases come and go, hovered over her keyboard, awaiting the next words. Everyone in the room seemed to understand that something larger was unfolding before them, something more significant than a simple parking ticket. Judge Maxwell's face reddened slightly. He seemed flustered as he adjusted his glasses. "Dr. Bennett, I assure you that your background has nothing to do with my judgment." Sarah placed both hands firmly on the podium, her posture straight and commanding. "Your Honor," she said, "let me tell you about my background. I've been teaching constitutional law at Harvard for 12 years. Before that, I clerked for the Supreme Court. The legal clinic I was running that day helps people who can't afford lawyers understand their rights." Her voice was calm but unwavering. "I'm here because I'm advocating for a group of people who often don't have the privilege to contest a parking ticket in the same way I can. I'm here because I care about fairness and justice, and I've spent my entire career ensuring that the law is applied to everyone, regardless of their background." The room was still, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. The judge was now fully aware of the mistake he had made, not just in issuing the ticket, but in his assumptions about who Sarah was and what she represented. For the first time, Sarah saw the judge soften. His earlier condescension had given way to an almost imperceptible shift, recognition, perhaps even respect, for the woman standing before him. The court had witnessed a rare moment of truth. Sarah Bennett had not just defended herself against a ticket. She had quietly and firmly reminded the court of the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, their title, or their background. In that brief moment, Sarah had made history, not by seeking recognition for herself, but by teaching a lesson about equality, bias, and the importance of challenging assumptions. As the judge cleared his throat, he gave his final ruling. "The citation will be dismissed," he said, his voice steadier now. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, Dr. Bennett." Sarah nodded, accepting the ruling with grace. As she left the courtroom, she knew this experience would stay with her, not just for what had happened to her in that moment, but for the lessons it had imparted to everyone in the room. Sarah paused, letting her words sink in. The elderly man with the shaking papers, who had earlier seemed lost in a sea of confusion, was now watching her with a look that could only be described as pride. He straightened slightly, his trembling hands now steady, his face softening as if Sarah's words had given him a renewed sense of dignity. The two lawyers who had been waiting for their own cases had stopped checking their phones and were now listening intently, eyes fixed on Sarah. It was as though the entire courtroom had shifted its focus, no longer just a collection of people and their legal obligations, but a space where something profound was taking place. Sarah continued, her voice calm but growing more deliberate. "I'd like to explain why I was parked in that no parking zone if you'll allow me to finish," she said, her gaze fixed on Judge Maxwell, who had begun to soften his stance. The judge, who had initially been so dismissive, now nodded slowly, his earlier impatience replaced by an unusual level of care. "Please proceed, Dr. Bennett," he said, his tone less authoritative, more open to hearing her side. Sarah took a deep breath before continuing. Mrs. Rodriguez, a 78-year-old grandmother, had just finished receiving assistance with her tenant rights paperwork when she began to experience chest pains. Her son was already waiting outside, but she couldn't walk the 2 blocks to where he was parked. She was frightened and in pain, and as you might expect, I didn't want her to have to walk further. So yes, Your Honor, I parked in a no-parking zone for 23 minutes while helping what could have been a heart attack victim reach her son's car. The courtroom fell silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was no longer the tense, uncomfortable quiet that had permeated the space when Sarah first entered. Now it was filled with a subtle sense of understanding. Sarah noticed that the elderly man had stopped clutching his papers, his posture straighter, his face showing a mixture of recognition and respect. The young mother, who had earlier struggled to calm her baby, was now sitting forward in her seat, her expression one of rapt attention. Even the court reporter, who had been typing almost non-stop, seemed to pause as if the weight of Sarah's words had affected her too. Sarah didn't stop there. She reached into her folder and pulled out a piece of paper. "I have here a note from the emergency room doctor who treated Mrs. Rodriguez that day," she continued. "She did in fact have a minor heart attack. The doctor's note states that receiving prompt medical attention was crucial for her recovery." The judge, who had been listening more carefully now, took the paper from Sarah. He read it carefully, his eyes scanning the text. His hands trembled slightly as he set the paper back down on the podium. The same man who had been so quick to dismiss Sarah's explanation earlier now looked deeply uncomfortable, his earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. "Dr. Bennett," Judge Maxwell said finally, his voice sounding smaller, almost apologetic. "Why didn't you mention this medical emergency at the start?" Sarah's reply was measured, her tone firm but not confrontational. "I tried, Your Honor. I tried to explain the situation 3 times. But each time, you seemed more interested in making assumptions about me than in listening to the facts of the case." There was a shift in the courtroom. Several people, including the young law clerk sitting at the back, nodded in agreement. The elderly man who had raised his hand earlier, his voice still shaking but now full of resolve, seemed to sit up straighter, his earlier fear replaced by a quiet pride. The young mother, who had been trying to calm her child, wiped a tear from her cheek, nodding in recognition of a truth that had been unspoken until now. Judge Maxwell removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, as though the weight of the moment had suddenly become too much for him to bear. He looked tired, but there was something more in his expression now, a weariness that came not just from physical exhaustion, but from the realization that he had failed to listen, failed to give Sarah the courtesy she deserved. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his voice softer, more human than before. "I owe you an apology. I made unfair assumptions about you and failed to give you the basic courtesy of presenting your case. The ticket is dismissed, of course, but I owe you more than just that." Sarah nodded, accepting the apology, but she didn't move to leave just yet. She reached into her folder once more and this time she pulled out something different. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "But I'd like to present something else for the court's consideration." Judge Maxwell raised an eyebrow, clearly curious. "Go ahead, Dr. Bennett," he said, adjusting his glasses and leaning forward slightly. "I'm listening." Sarah held up a stack of papers, her gaze sweeping across the room, noting how every person in the courtroom was now focused on her. The tension had dissipated, replaced by a palpable curiosity. The young law clerk was scribbling notes in his pad. The young mother had stopped fidgeting with her baby and was paying close attention. Even the bailiff, who had been moving about the room with his usual routine, had stopped to listen. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. It felt as though everyone, including the judge, was waiting to hear what Sarah would say next. "This," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the space, "is data from a recent study on racial and gender bias in traffic court proceedings. I've spent the last 3 years working with my team to observe over 2,000 traffic court sessions across 12 different jurisdictions. We've documented disturbing patterns of bias that I believe should concern us all." Judge Maxwell's expression grew more serious with each number Sarah presented. The statistics she shared were stark. Over the past 5 years, Black and Hispanic defendants in traffic court had been 3 times more likely to receive maximum fines for the same violations as white defendants. Women of color, particularly, had been interrupted an average of 4 times more often during their testimony. Sarah paused for a moment, letting the numbers settle in. The courtroom was quiet now, save for the clicking of the court reporter's fingers on the keyboard. 2 more lawyers had entered the courtroom, drawn in by the unusual scene unfolding before them. They stood in the back watching intently. "Cases where defendants were addressed by name," Sarah continued, her voice unwavering, "white men were called Sir or Mr. 98% of the time. For Black women with advanced degrees, however, correct titles were used only 27% of the time. even when their credentials were clearly stated in court documents. There was another pause as Sarah allowed the significance of her words to sink in. The young law student in the gallery had stopped scribbling and was now watching Sarah with rapt attention. The young mother wiped another tear from her eye, nodding quietly. Sarah's words were resonating, no longer just abstract statistics but real experiences that people in the room could relate to. "These aren't just numbers, Your Honor," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "These are real people, real experiences, real justice being delayed or denied because of unconscious bias. The same bias that led you to dismiss my explanation before even hearing it." Judge Maxwell, for the first time, seemed genuinely moved. He removed his glasses again, but this time it wasn't from tiredness. His hands weren't quite steady as he placed them on the bench. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "How long have you been collecting this data?" Sarah replied, her answer steady and unwavering. 3 years. My team has observed more than 2,000 court sessions across 12 jurisdictions, documenting patterns that reflect a much larger systemic issue in our justice system. The elderly man who had been clutching his paperwork earlier raised his hand once again, his voice shaking but determined. "I've been here 6 times, he said, his eyes meeting Sarah's. "Every time they treat me like I'm stupid because of my age and my race. Never let me finish explaining, just like they did to you, Dr. Bennett." Sarah turned to face him, nodding respectfully. "Sir, would you be willing to share your experience as part of our ongoing research?" The man's posture straightened, and for the first time he seemed proud of his words. "Yes, ma'am. I surely would." Judge Maxwell cleared his throat and sat back in his chair. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his tone more thoughtful than before, "I believe your research deserves a wider audience. Would you be willing to present these findings at our next judicial training session?" Sarah looked around the courtroom. The young mother, still seated at the edge of her seat, had hope clear in her eyes. The young law student had stopped taking notes and was watching Sarah with a newfound respect. Even the bailiff, who had seen countless cases come and go, was moved by what was happening. "I would be happy to, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice steady but tinged with a sense of urgency. "But more than that, I'd like to see this data used in practical ways. This can't just be another lecture. It needs to be a catalyst for change." Judge Maxwell nodded, a deep, thoughtful look in his eyes. "I agree, Dr. Bennett. Let's start that change here." With that, Sarah had not only contested a parking ticket, but had also planted the seed for systemic change in how the justice system treated people, especially those who had been historically marginalized. Sarah paused, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. She had already made a compelling case for her reasons behind parking in the no-parking zone, but now she had something bigger to propose. The courtroom, once filled with tension, now held a breathless anticipation. The judge, still processing the significance of her words, was staring at her, his expression unreadable. Sarah knew this was the moment to push further, to make the kind of change that could have a lasting impact beyond her individual case. "I'd like to propose something else, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, but tinged with determination. The judge leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "What if we used this courtroom, your courtroom, as a pilot program for change?" she continued, her gaze never wavering from Judge Maxwell's. She could feel the weight of her words in the room, the subtle shift in the air. Judge Maxwell, who had been known for his stern, no-nonsense demeanor, seemed intrigued. "What kind of change?" he asked, his tone softer now, as if Sarah had cracked open a door to a possibility he hadn't considered before. "Simple changes at first," Sarah explained, her voice growing more confident. "Allowing people to finish their explanations without interruption. Using proper titles consistently for everyone, regardless of their appearance or background. Recording demographic data on fine amounts and interruptions. These small steps could make a big difference, Your Honor. And they wouldn't require a complete overhaul of the system, just a commitment to fairness and a willingness to listen." The judge sat quietly for a long moment, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest of his chair. The whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his response. Finally he spoke, his voice thoughtful but tinged with regret. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his tone heavy, "I've been on this bench for 15 years. I've always prided myself on being fair and impartial, but today you've shown me that perhaps I haven't been as fair as I thought. I accept your proposal." A murmur of approval spread through the courtroom, and Sarah felt a wave of emotion rise within her. The elderly man who had been clutching his papers earlier, the one who had watched her with a mix of fear and uncertainty, now smiled faintly. The young mother, Maria, who had been watching intently, seemed to exhale with relief. Even the court reporter, who had been focused on typing every word of the proceedings, looked up and smiled through tears. This moment was more than just a legal victory, it was a step toward something greater. "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "When would you like to begin?" Judge Maxwell glanced at his watch, then scanned the room. The energy in the courtroom had shifted, and he realized that this moment was too important to let slip by. "Right now, Dr. Bennett," he replied. "Right now." Sarah nodded, understanding the significance of this decision. What had started as a simple parking ticket hearing was now morphing into something far more meaningful. The change that Sarah had hoped for was no longer just an abstract idea, it was happening right before her eyes, and she had the chance to be part of it. She opened her folder again, ready to help shape the future of this small corner of the justice system. The next few hours in Judge Maxwell's courtroom became something no one present would ever forget. Instead of moving on to the next case, the judge did something unprecedented. He transformed his traffic court into an impromptu forum for justice reform. He addressed the waiting room, looking out at the people who had gathered for what they thought would be routine hearings. "If you're comfortable sharing," Judge Maxwell began, his voice steady, "I'd like to hear from others who feel they've been treated unfairly in this court system." At first there was hesitation. People exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of whether this was truly a real opportunity or just a fleeting moment. But Sarah, standing quietly beside the podium, seemed to give them courage. Slowly, one by one, hands began to rise. Maria Torres, the young mother who had been watching everything unfold, stood up first. She held her baby close to her chest, her voice trembling at first but gaining strength as she spoke. "My name is Maria Torres," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "Last month I was fined $200 for being 5 minutes late to court. My babysitter canceled and I had to bring my son with me. Nobody asked why I was late. Nobody cared that I had to take 2 buses to get here." Judge Maxwell nodded, his face filled with empathy. "Please make a note to review Mrs. Torres's case," he said, gesturing to his clerk. Then he turned back to Maria. "I apologize for not considering your circumstances. Please continue." More stories followed. An elderly Asian woman spoke about being mocked for her accent. A young black man described being treated as suspicious despite wearing his hospital scrubs after a night shift. A Hispanic teenager shared how no one believed he was a college student when he tried to explain his parking violation near the university library. Sarah listened intently, taking careful notes, her research skills kicking in as she documented each testimony. The court reporter, who had never typed so many personal stories in traffic court before, had to pause several times to wipe her eyes. Even the bailiff, who had stood by silently throughout the hearing, now seemed moved by the stories being shared. Judge Maxwell, once the stern, detached figure at the head of the courtroom, now seemed deeply concerned. His face, which had started the day looking hard and impassive, had softened. He listened to each person with growing understanding and genuine interest, his brow furrowed in thought. "Dr. Bennett," he said during a brief pause, "I see now that what happened with you today wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern I've been blind to for years." Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. "Recognition is the first step toward change, Your Honor. Would you like to hear my suggestions for immediate improvements?" she asked, her voice steady and filled with purpose. Judge Maxwell gestured for her to proceed, and the young law student who had been taking notes earlier pulled out a fresh page, ready to capture every word. Sarah began her proposal. "First, we implement a mandatory 5-minute listening period for each case. No interruptions, no assumptions, just allowing people to tell their stories." She walked closer to the judge's bench, her confidence growing with each step. "Second, require all court staff to use proper titles and honorifics consistently for everyone, regardless of their appearance or background." There was a pause as everyone absorbed her words. Sarah took another step, feeling the weight of the moment. "Third, we start collecting data on fine amounts, demographics, and treatment in court. We need to make this data transparent and public so we can hold ourselves accountable." At that moment, the bailiff, who had been standing quietly all this time, spoke up. "Your Honor, if I may?" At the judge's nod, he continued. "I could help track that data. I see everything that happens in this courtroom anyway." Judge Maxwell smiled for the first time that day, a genuine, appreciative smile. "Thank you, Officer Johnson," he said. "That would be very helpful." Sarah pulled out one more paper from her folder. "I have a draft proposal for these changes, Your Honor. I wrote it as part of my research, hoping someday to find a judge willing to implement it." The judge looked at the document, then at the filled courtroom. People who had come expecting quick, impersonal hearings were now engaged in something historic. They were witnessing the beginning of real change in their local justice system. "Dr. Bennett," Judge Maxwell said, his voice filled with quiet respect, "would you be willing to work with this court to implement these changes? Perhaps serve as an advisor as we reform our procedures?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, considering her busy schedule at Harvard, her research, and her classes. But then she looked around the room. She saw Maria Torres still holding her baby, her eyes shining with hope. She saw the elderly man who had been afraid earlier, now sitting tall and proud. And she remembered all the time she had taught her students about being agents of change in the legal system. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice firm. "I would be honored to help." The room burst into spontaneous applause. Judge Maxwell had to tap his gavel gently to restore order, but even he was smiling as he did so. What had started as a simple parking ticket hearing was transforming into something none of them could have predicted. A real chance for change in the justice system, starting right here in this Boston traffic court. Word spread quickly through Boston's legal community about what was happening in Judge Maxwell's courtroom. By the following week, when Sarah arrived for the first official Reform Committee meeting, she found the judge's chambers packed with interested observers. Lawyers from various firms sat shoulder to shoulder with community activists. 3 other judges from different courts had come to learn. Maria Torres was there too, now employed as a part-time translator for the court, her baby sleeping peacefully in a carrier beside her. The seeds of change had been planted, and they were beginning to grow. Sarah stepped into Judge Maxwell's chambers, greeted warmly by the judge, a far cry from their first encounter. The room had changed, as had both of them. It wasn't just the physical space, there was a palpable difference in the atmosphere. They had come a long way since that fateful day in traffic court, and it was clear from the way Judge Maxwell stood, greeting her with a genuine smile, that they were both committed to something much bigger than just reforming the court system. This wasn't simply about changing processes anymore, it was about creating a shift in how justice was delivered to the people of Boston. The change, once a distant idea, was now unfolding in real time, and Sarah could feel the weight of it as she entered the room. Before they dove into the day's discussions, Judge Maxwell had something to show her. "Before we begin, Dr. Bennett, I have something I'd like to show you," he said, gesturing toward a stack of papers on his desk. She took a seat, intrigued. The judge handed her the papers, which contained statistics from the past week since the new policies had been implemented. Sarah's eyes immediately went to the numbers, scanning through them quickly. The results were already showing positive shifts. The average hearing times had increased by only 3 minutes, but what truly stood out were the citizen satisfaction scores. They had doubled. These small procedural changes, letting people tell their stories without interruption and addressing them with respect, had transformed the atmosphere of the court. The room, once tense and filled with anxiety, had started to feel more human, more understanding. Sarah's eyes flicked up to meet the judge's as she reviewed the data. "This is impressive," she said, her voice reflecting her appreciation for the strides they had made so far. "But we're just getting started." She pulled out her laptop and connected it to the projector in the room. The screen flickered to life, displaying a presentation titled "Building a Fair Justice System, the Boston Traffic Court Initiative." The room fell silent as Sarah began to speak. "In just 1 week, we've seen some truly remarkable changes," she said, her clear and confident voice filling the room. "And we've learned a lot along the way." The audience, comprising judges, community leaders, and legal professionals, watched attentively as Sarah proceeded. She began showing photographs that told a powerful story. A young man in work clothes, addressed respectfully as "Sir" by court staff. An elderly woman taking her full 5 minutes to explain her situation in her native language, with Maria translating carefully, and of course Judge Maxwell sitting attentively, his face showing genuine interest in each case, listening patiently. The images painted a picture of a transformed court, one where the humanity of those involved was acknowledged, not ignored. "These small changes," Sarah continued, "have already begun to affect how people view our justice system. Last week, a woman came up to me after her hearing and told me that, for the first time in her life, she felt heard in court." She paused, letting the words resonate in the room. She could see the effect they were having as a few of the attendees nodded thoughtfully. It was then that the elderly man, Mr. Washington, who had first spoken up in the initial hearing, raised his hand. Now known by all in the courtroom, he spoke with the quiet pride of someone who had witnessed and participated in something meaningful. "I've been telling people in my neighborhood about the changes," he said, his voice rich with pride. "Some of them had given up on ever being treated fairly in court. Now they're willing to try again." Sarah smiled at Mr. Washington, who had become an invaluable advocate for change in the community. His words were proof that the changes were not only visible within the courtroom walls but were reverberating through the streets of Boston. The people were starting to believe again, starting to feel that their voices mattered. Judge Maxwell, moved by the stories of change he had just witnessed, stood up and moved to stand beside Sarah. The room grew quiet in anticipation of his words. "What Dr. Bennett and all of you have helped us create here," he began, his voice filled with emotion, "is more than just procedural changes. We're rebuilding trust between the court and the community." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. For years people felt dismissed, ignored, and unseen. What we're doing here today is showing that justice isn't just about applying the law. It's about seeing and hearing the people in front of us, really hearing them. A reporter from the Boston Globe, who had been quietly taking notes in the corner, raised her hand. "Judge Maxwell," she asked, "would you say that this experience has changed how you view your role as a judge?" The room seemed to hold its breath as all eyes turned toward Judge Maxwell. He looked at Sarah for a moment, his gaze thoughtful, then turned back to the reporter. "Absolutely," he said without hesitation. "Dr. Bennett showed me that true justice isn't just about applying the law. It's about seeing and hearing the people who come before us, really hearing them." His words, firm and resolute, were met with nods of agreement from the other judges in the room. One of the judges, Judge Roberts, spoke up next. "I'd like to implement these changes in my courtroom too," he said, his voice filled with the same enthusiasm that Sarah had seen in Judge Maxwell. "Could you help us set that up, Dr. Bennett?" Before Sarah could respond, other voices began to chime in with similar requests. The city council wanted to hear about the progress they had made, with some members eager to push for similar reforms in other courts. The police department was asking about training sessions for officers. A state senator sitting at the back of the room was already talking about potential legislation to support the changes in the broader justice system. The momentum was building, and Sarah could see that their work was far from over. It was only just beginning. Maria Torres, now a confident community leader, stood up, gently rocking her baby in her arms. "Dr. Bennett," she asked, "would you be willing to do a workshop in Spanish? Many in my community want to understand their rights better." Her request was met with murmurs of approval from the others in the room. Sarah looked around at all the faces eager for change and felt a surge of hope. It was clear that this initiative had grown beyond the confines of the courtroom. It was becoming a movement for social change, one that touched lives and empowered communities. She remembered that first day in traffic court, when it had seemed like just another case of bias and dismissal. She could have walked away, but instead she had chosen to stand up, to challenge the system, and now here they were, 3 months later, seeing tangible results. This wasn't just a case study, it was a catalyst for transformation. Sarah stood before the group, ready to answer their requests, but first she had one condition. "Yes," she said, her voice firm, "I will help with all of this. But on one condition." The room fell silent, everyone leaning forward in anticipation. "This can't be about me or Judge Maxwell or any single person," Sarah said, gesturing broadly to include everyone in the room. "This has to be about building a system that works for everyone. We need to hear from all voices, especially those that have been silenced for too long." The room erupted in applause, the sound echoing through the walls. Judge Maxwell beamed with pride, his face flushed with the excitement of the moment. Mr. Washington wiped away a tear, his hands shaking slightly as he clapped. Maria Torres hugged her baby close, her heart full of gratitude. Sarah looked out at the room, seeing hope and determination in their faces. She knew in that moment that this was just the beginning. What had started as a simple confrontation in traffic court had grown into something much larger. A real movement for change in the justice system, starting right here in Boston. 3 months after that transformative day in the traffic court, Sarah sat in her Harvard office, reviewing the latest data from what the media had begun calling the Boston Justice Initiative. The changes had spread far beyond that first courtroom, creating ripples throughout the entire legal system. On her desk was the Boston Globe, featuring a front-page story about their progress. The headline read, "From Traffic Court to Social Justice: How One Professor's Stand Changed Boston's Legal System." Next to it was a photograph of Sarah and Judge Maxwell speaking to a packed auditorium at the State House, their faces filled with the energy of a shared mission. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from Maria Torres. "Dr. Bennett, we just finished our 100th Spanish language rights workshop. The community center can barely hold all the people coming to learn." Sarah smiled, remembering how Maria had gone from a nervous young mother in traffic court to a confident community leader. Maria was now running daily workshops to help people understand their legal rights, with her little boy often playing quietly in the corner as she taught. Just as she was reflecting on these successes, there was a knock at her office door. It was Mr. Washington, dressed in a neat suit and carrying a folder. At 72, he had become one of their most effective advocates, speaking at community meetings and sharing his experiences with young law students. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement, "you won't believe what happened in Judge Roberts's court this morning." Sarah gestured for him to sit down, intrigued. Mr. Washington had been their official court observer for the past month, documenting how different judges implemented the new policies. "A young white judge," Mr. Washington said proudly, stopped proceedings to correct a lawyer who kept interrupting his black client. "He said he learned from our training sessions about listening to every voice." Sarah nodded, adding this new report to her growing collection of positive changes. The ripples of change were becoming waves. Her computer pinged with an email from Judge Maxwell, marked urgent. 20 minutes later, Sarah walked into his chambers, eager to hear what the next chapter of their shared journey would bring. Dr. Sarah Bennett stood at the podium in the Grand Hall of the Massachusetts State House, gazing out at the sea of faces in the audience. The room was packed with judges, lawyers, community leaders, and citizens from across the country, all gathered for the first national conference on judicial reform. It had been 1 year since that transformative day in Boston's traffic court, and Sarah now stood before a national audience, ready to share the progress they had made in revolutionizing the justice system. Behind her on stage stood a group of remarkable individuals who had been with her throughout the journey. Judge Maxwell, now the head of the state judicial training program, Maria Torres, recently appointed as the director of community outreach for the courts, and Mr. Washington, whose documented observations had become a published training manual. They, along with representatives from 30 different states, were there to learn from what had become known as the Bennett Method, a new approach to creating fairness and accountability in the courtroom. The year had been nothing short of transformative. It began with a chance encounter in a Boston traffic court, an encounter that sparked a revolution in how justice was delivered. Sarah's voice was steady and clear as she began her address, reflecting on how far they had come. "A year ago, I walked into a traffic court expecting to pay a fine. Instead, I found a calling that would change not just my life, but the lives of thousands of others," she began, her words resonating through the hall. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, which displayed a graph of the year's results. The numbers were striking. Civilian complaints against courts had decreased by 60%, successful case resolutions had increased by 45%, and community trust in the judicial system had risen by 70%. These figures told part of the story, but Sarah knew they weren't the whole picture. "Numbers don't tell the whole story," Sarah continued. "Let me show you what real change looks like." The screen behind her shifted to show a series of photographs that captured the heart of their work. A Spanish-speaking grandmother confidently presenting her case through a court translator. A young black man being addressed as doctored by court staff, an acknowledgement of respect that was long overdue. Judge Maxwell was shown teaching other judges about active listening and bias recognition. From her seat in the front row, Maria's young son, now a toddler, waved excitedly at Sarah. He had become the unofficial mascot of their movement, growing up in courthouses and community centers where his mother had helped people find their voices. Sarah's voice grew more passionate as she continued. "The changes we've implemented aren't complicated," she said. 5 minutes of uninterrupted speaking time, proper use of titles and honorifics, regular bias training for all court staff. These simple steps have restored dignity to every person who enters a courtroom. The images behind her continued to scroll, showing Mr. Washington training new court observers, Maria leading workshops in community centers, and judges sitting alongside local residents, learning firsthand about the struggles and hopes of the communities they served. The room felt energized by these images, and the audience was silent, captivated by the vision Sarah was presenting. "But our biggest achievement," Sarah said, her voice growing even more fervent, "isn't in these photographs." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in. "It's in the stories we hear every day. The mother who finally felt safe bringing her children to court. The elderly immigrant who said he was treated like a human being for the first time in his legal journey. The young lawyer who told me she finally feels proud to be part of the system." As Sarah spoke, she saw the faces of those who had become integral to the movement. She gestured to Maria, who was now standing, holding a thick binder in her hands. "Today we're releasing our complete training program," Sarah announced. "Every form, every resource, and every step we've used to implement these changes. We want to give every court in the nation the tools they need to treat people with dignity, respect, and fairness. Judge Maxwell, who had been standing quietly to the side, now moved to join Sarah at the podium. Dr. Bennett's work has fundamentally changed how we view justice, he said, his voice filled with pride. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was part of the problem. But thanks to her, I learned how to be part of the solution. The Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, sitting in the front row, nodded in agreement. The impact of their work was clear, and it was only just beginning to spread. Next week, the Chief Justice would announce a nationwide initiative based on Sarah's program, taking the lessons learned in Massachusetts and applying them across the country. This was more than just a local effort. It was a movement that was resonating nationwide. The idea that justice should be fair, accessible, and humane was catching on. As Sarah glanced down at her notes, she felt a sense of pride, but also a deep understanding of how far they had come. A year ago, she said, her voice steady and confident, I could have just paid that parking ticket. I could have stayed quiet, accepted the disrespect, and gone back to my comfortable office at Harvard. But that would have meant accepting a broken system. The room was completely silent now, hanging on her every word. She paused, allowing the significance of the moment to sink in. Instead, we chose to speak up, to challenge, to change. And look what happened. Not because of me, but because of every person in this room who decided that justice should mean justice for all. The crowd erupted into applause, but Sarah wasn't finished. She was just getting started. This isn't about one person or one court, she said, her voice strong and resolute. This is about a collective effort to rebuild trust in the justice system, to ensure that every person who walks through a courthouse door is treated with respect and fairness. This is about creating a system that works for everyone, no matter their background, their race, or their socioeconomic status. She paused, looking out at the audience, feeling the weight of the responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders. But she also felt a deep sense of gratitude and pride. What had started as a simple idea, an idea born from frustration in a traffic court, had grown into a nationwide movement that was changing the face of justice in America. It wasn't just about reforming the system, it was about transforming how people saw each other, how they interacted with the law, and how they trusted the institutions meant to serve them. Maria Torres, standing at the front of the room, was a testament to the success of the movement. From a nervous young mother to a leader in the community, Maria had become an essential part of the effort. She was now leading workshops, educating people on their rights and empowering them to speak up for themselves. Maria's son, who had grown up in the courthouse, was a symbol of the future they were working toward, one where justice was not just a concept, but a reality for everyone. As Sarah looked out at the crowd, she felt the enormity of what they had achieved, but she also understood that this was just the beginning. There was still so much to be done. The work that had been started in Boston had begun to spread across the country, and now, with the Chief Justice's endorsement, it had the potential to reach every corner of the United States. Today, Sarah concluded, we are releasing our complete training program. This is not just a manual for change, it is a blueprint for a fairer, more just system. We're not done yet, but we've made a start. And together we'll continue this journey, until justice truly means justice for all. The applause that followed was deafening, and as Sarah stood at the podium, surrounded by those who had helped make this moment possible, she knew that the revolution in justice was only just beginning, and she was ready to lead it, one court at a time. 5 years had passed since that transformative day in Boston's traffic court, and Sarah Bennett stood in front of the United States Supreme Court building, allowing herself a moment to absorb the weight of the occasion. Today was monumental. They were about to present the National Judicial Reform Act, a piece of legislation that had grown from the efforts she had begun in that small Boston courtroom. The group of supporters gathered behind her was a testament to the far-reaching impact of their work. Among them was Judge Maxwell, his hair now fully white, standing tall in his judicial robes. Maria Torres, once a nervous young mother, was now a state representative, carrying with her a thick folder filled with testimonials from thousands of citizens who had been touched by the reforms. Despite his advanced age, Mr. Washington insisted on being present for this historic moment, embodying the tireless commitment to change that had begun with him. As Sarah took in the crowd gathering on the Supreme Court steps, representatives from all 50 states, news cameras lining the street, and law students holding signs that read "Justice for All," she was reminded of the magnitude of their journey. She spotted a familiar face in the crowd, a young law student who had witnessed the first day in traffic court. Now, standing before her as an accomplished legal professional, the young woman had become Judge Melissa Chin, the youngest black female judge in Massachusetts history. "Can you believe we're really here?" Melissa asked, her eyes shining with excitement as she joined Sarah. Sarah turned to the crowd, feeling a sense of awe and disbelief. "It's amazing, isn't it?" she replied, knowing full well that the vision they had started with 5 years ago had grown into something far beyond what they could have imagined. Their program had been adopted by more than 200 court systems across the country, bias complaints in participating courts had dropped by 85%, and community trust in the judicial system had reached historic highs. The reform had spread not just because of Sarah's work but because of the many people who had embraced and championed the cause. Maria's son, now in first grade, tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "Dr. Bennett, look," he exclaimed, pointing to a school bus that had just pulled up. It was filled with children from local schools, all there to witness this historic moment. The significance of this day was not lost on Sarah. These children would grow up in a world where the justice system was not something to be feared or distrusted but something to be believed in, thanks to the work that had been done over the past few years. Just then, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court emerged from the building and walked directly toward Sarah. She extended her hand and with a warm smile she said, "Dr. Bennett, before we begin the formal proceedings, I want you to see something." Sarah nodded and followed the Chief Justice inside to the public hall of the Supreme Court. There, mounted on the wall, was a large photograph of that first traffic courtroom in Boston, taken on the day everything changed. Sarah felt a surge of emotion as she gazed at the image. Beside it hung her Harvard, Idaho card, the one she had shown to Judge Maxwell that fateful morning. A plaque beneath them read, "Where Justice Reformed, the Beginning of the Bennett Method, 2024. Sarah's eyes welled with tears as she read the words. Judge Maxwell, who had been walking quietly by her side, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You changed everything that day," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "You changed me." Mr. Washington, despite his advanced age, stepped forward, his voice strong and unwavering. "You showed us all that one person speaking up can make a difference," he said proudly. "Now look how many voices are being heard." As the main hall began to fill with people, Sarah's heart swelled with pride. Judges from across the country, many of whom had transformed their own courtrooms using the Bennett method, were in attendance. Community leaders who had helped spread the program were present, as well as law students who had studied the changes as part of their curriculum. The moment was overwhelming, and it felt as though all the effort, all the setbacks, and all the triumphs had led to this one moment of validation. Maria walked up to Sarah, holding her tablet. "Look at these numbers," she said, her voice beaming with pride. "Last month, every single state reported improved satisfaction rates in their courts. The Spanish-language program alone has helped over 100,000 people." Judge Chin, now a trusted leader in the movement, added, "And the best part? Applications to law school from minority students have doubled. People believe they can be part of the system now. They trust it." The Chief Justice called everyone to attention, signaling that it was time to present the legislation. But before the formal proceedings began, Sarah gathered her original team close. "Remember where this started?" she said quietly, her voice filled with reflection. "One parking ticket. One moment of standing up. One decision to speak instead of staying silent." Judge Maxwell nodded, understanding the significance of Sarah's words. "And now look where we are," he said, his voice filled with awe. Maria held her son's hand, both of them standing together as Sarah looked around at the people who had helped make this moment possible. Mr. Washington, always the voice of hope and optimism, smiled. "Look who we're bringing with us," he said, his voice strong with pride. As the group walked into the Supreme Court chamber together, Sarah couldn't help but think about all the people who would never know the disrespect she had faced that day in traffic court. They would never know the anger and frustration she had felt as she stood in that courtroom, fighting for her dignity, fighting for a system that should have been fair but wasn't. But the changes they had made were now deeply embedded in the system. Future generations would take for granted the right to be heard, to be treated with dignity, and to be seen as human beings first. As they entered the chamber, Sarah felt a deep sense of accomplishment, but she also knew that the work wasn't over. This wasn't just about changing the laws. It was about changing the hearts and minds of the people who made up the justice system. It was about proving that justice could be both fair and compassionate, and that every voice, no matter who it came from, deserved to be heard. The Chief Justice called the session to order, and as the room settled into silence, Sarah stood, ready to present their case for nationwide reform. She looked back at the supporters who had gathered around her. Judges, citizens, students, and seniors, people from all walks of life who had come together to fight for a more just and fair system. This, she realized, was her true legacy. Not just changing the system but changing the very way people thought about justice. This was the beginning of a new era. The highest court in the land was ready to listen, and Sarah Bennett was ready to speak.